Hey everyone, it's Selwen here. Let's talk about the Retribution Paladin. Now, I was never a huge fan of Retribution ever since the Legion revamp, if you will. I always found the spec to be a little bit too monotonous, but there is changes in Shadowlands primarily due to the unpruning that does make the spec feel overall more fun to play. I actually had a good time with this in Shadowlands, especially in Torghast. You can have some amazing times in Torghast as a Retribution Paladin. But the primary reason for that is because the spec simply feels more complete. So let's go over why I say that. Why does it feel more complete? Well, you have your unpruned abilities, and one of those include Wake of Ashes. Yes, they finally came to their senses, and they gave us Wake of Ashes baseline again since Legion. Now, it's a little bit nerfed. It's now only generating 3 holy power as opposed to the 5, but it still feels nice, right? You're not gonna notice a huge difference. It's a small nerf. It still feels good, and it still is a pretty great ability to use. And in a world where we have a lot of target caps, so for an example, in Divine Storm, we now have a target cap of 5 enemies, much like many other abilities in the game right now in Shadowlands to kind of tone down the AoE in Mythic Plus, which sucks. I'm not gonna say it doesn't suck. It's not a huge deal, but in the end it does suck a little bit. But Wake of Ashes actually hits all targets in front of you, so that's pretty cool. So there's Wake of Ashes. You're also getting, Consecration. Consecration is also being made baseline, okay, so it's yet another AoE ability. The damage is a little bit low right now. It's hitting a little bit too low, so I'm not entirely sure if this is gonna be worth the press. It's kind of like a flavorful ability at this point, from what I can tell, but it's still pretty cool to have it. And it's 2 talents, right? Wake of Ashes and Consecration that is opening up in our, talent rows. And we're going to talk about those in a minute as well. Another ability that has become baseline is Hammer of Wrath. So Hammer of Wrath is again another ability that they finally came to their senses and it gave us baseline. So pretty much is working in the same way as BFA. It's an execute ability, is generating 1 holy power, and you can use it on any target rather, regardless of health during Avenging Wrath. But that little modifier comes at level 58. Not so when we get the pre-patch, for an example, we're gonna be at level 50, I believe. So you're not gonna have that little modifier on there. So you're gonna have to work on that till level 58. But still pretty goddamn cool. We also got another baseline ability from our talents, which is Word of Glory. Now, it no longer heals 3 targets, which sucks a little bit, but again, it's baseline. So it's again opening up our talents and making the spec overall more feature complete, which, well, is a very big positive in my book. We're also getting Blessing of Sacrifice. Obviously, this was something that the other Paladin specs had, so there was no reason why Retribution couldn't have this ability. So again, pretty nice to have it. Some extra utility to have, say, Mythic Plus or even Raids. There are some pretty great situations where you can use this in some pretty cool ways. What else are you getting? Well, you're also getting auras. Yes, auras are back. Now, they are not a huge deal. They kind of feel like flavorful abilities. Now, they are useful, don't get me wrong. They are very useful, and you definitely want to have a paladin in your raid group or even in your dungeon because of them. But they are not a huge deal. So you're getting Crusader Aura, which is just the mounted speed aura. We had this as a passive, so now you just have to click it. We're getting Devotion Aura, which obviously is far more useful, just reducing damage that we take by 3% and everyone in a party or raid. We have Concentration Aura, which is making interrupts and silence effects last for 3% less, so 30% shorter, I mean. So again, also pretty useful. These two are awesome to have together in a group. And then you have Retribution Aura, which is pretty cool, but also a little bit weird. Now, I don't necessarily want to have the old boring Retribution Aura that was just a basic damage when you get hit. That was a little bit boring. That's something that should stay in Classic. But the current version is a little bit weird. Why? Because when you have it up, any party member or raid member that dies, you're going to gain Avenging Wrath. Now, thematically, that is kind of awesome, right? Because you kind of like avenging your friends if they die. And obviously, damage-wise, this is pretty cool. And healers, for example, and protection paladins, holy paladins also get this. So there's a cool use with this. There's cool things that you can do with this when people die. And again, thematically, it's very cool. I just find it really weird to have this as an aura, right? I find it super, super weird to have this as an aura. I mean, generally, you kind of want to have Devotion Aura up if no other paladin is doing so. But, if you're progressing a raid or something, Retribution Aura might come in handy for some cool damage windows that you can potentially put out. So, I mean, I don't know. I just find it weird that it is on an aura. This could potentially just be a passive, in my opinion, and put something else on here that would make more sense for an aura. But anyway, that's just me. So again, our baseline spec just feels more complete. It feels like a Retribution Paladin should feel, right? It just feels complete. Having Wake of Ashes is great for some on-demand holy power and is a pretty great cleave ability. Consecration is just a classic ability, nice to have back. And in general, the spec just flows a little bit better. You have a lot more buttons to click. You have your Hammer of Wrath, which is so iconic. It's such a cool ability. So it, in general, again, just feels more feature complete. So let's look into the talents now to see what they have changed, because a lot of those baseline abilities that we had were on our talents. So what do we have here? So first tier is essentially the same. Second tier, we did get a new one, which is Hyperion Power. I always forget how to pronounce that word. It's a weird word for me. It's essentially another proc, very much like Divine Purpose. So essentially it's going to make your Crusader strikes have a 15% chance to make your Divine Storm free and deal 25% additional damage. So essentially it's going to allow you to go for more Divine Storms, which for dungeons, for any sort of cleave and stuff like that, is pretty fun to use. It's actually very good to use as well, and pretty fun to use. I love procs on my Retribution Paladin because I feel it makes the spec a whole lot more fun. So essentially what you're going to be able to do with this, especially when you combine with Divine Purpose, is just, again, do a lot of Divine Storms, sometimes back to back, which is pretty cool in dungeons. I might put some footage in the background just for you to get an idea how many Divine Storms you can put out. Now, if you're taking this, obviously you are likely to also use Divine Storm on single target, because let's say you take this in a dungeon, just, for you can do more AoE damage, you're going to get those procs on bosses, right? So, not entirely sure if the damage is going to be worth the price in single target fights. I mean, I find it cool because it's, it's another ability that you're going to be able to click, and it's free, so, it's just wasting a global cooldown. But again, the numbers will kind of decide on that, if it's going to be worth the price in single target. Personally, I enjoy having extra abilities to use. It just feels fun to me. Then on this tier, everything is the same here. So on this tier, we get a lot of changes as well. So now Divine Purpose is down here, which is just great. It's a great talent in my opinion. It makes the spec really fun by having these procs, makes it more unpredictable, right? It makes the spec more unpredictable. So I find it fun. And so here it doesn't have to fight the last tier talents, which is great. In terms of how it works, it's the same. Then we have Holy Avenger. Now they changed this a little bit to not just provide haste, but instead make your holy power generation triple. Now I'm going to put some footage in the background for this because it's a big cooldown and I want to show you a couple of abilities, and I don't want to have to talk for 3 minutes while the cooldown resets, so I can show you those set abilities. But essentially what this is providing is bigger burst windows, okay? So if you combine, say, with Crusade, if you combine if you combine these two, what's going to happen is that you're going to be able to stack up the Crusade buff extremely quickly, and in general, you're just going to be able to put out a shitload of spenders, a shitload of Templar's Verdict for very juicy damage. Now, it is making your spec, it is making Retribution further being, very focused on cooldown windows, right? Your damage is going to be very focused around those cooldown windows, and Holy Avenger cooldown does not align with Crusade, which kind of sucks. So it's a very bursty option. It's very fun to use, but it's a very bursty option. Alternatively, you can actually combine, say, Holy Avenger with Sanctified Wrath, which is a new talent, which is making Avenging Wrath last 25% longer, and is making your spenders deal Holy Light in an explosion to all nearby enemies. So essentially, it's your trait that we have currently in Azerite. And so if you go for Holy Avenger, you're going to be able to put out a lot of explosions for, again, bursty damage, but in AoE. So there's a couple of cool things you can do with Holy Avenger, but again, it's just on these big windows and these big cooldown windows, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But yeah, it is fun for what it's trying to do. But for example, speaking of Sanctified Wrath, if you go for Divine Purpose, if you go for Hyperion Power, if you're lucky with procs and stuff like that, which generally, I mean, having two talents that are providing you procs, so generally you're going to be lucky with procs during your Avenging Wrath, you're going to be able to put out a lot of explosions for that AoE damage, which is also pretty cool. It's a cool combo. I love this combo for dungeons that I've been trying out. It feels really fun. Then we have Seraphin. Not sure if that's how you say it, but you have Seraphin. Now this was a protection ability. It's essentially giving you a buff. It's costing 3 holy power and it's giving you a buff. It looks super cool. Okay, let me just put it out so I can show you. Whoops. It looks pretty cool, right? So you get a hammer, right? A very paladin-esque look. And essentially it's just allowing you for, these smaller windows of extra damage. So what I feel this ability is doing is kind of combating and the issue that Retribution Paladins have, where a lot of our damage is centered around our cooldown windows. So Seraphin is giving you these moments where you can just put out a little bit extra damage outside of, say, Avenging Wrath and stuff like that. Obviously, you can combine with Avenging Wrath, and it looks awesome, right? It looks phenomenal. But again, it's just a flat damage increase every 45 seconds. You do have to plan around this a little bit due to the holy power cost, but it feels good to use as well. Just it requires a lot more button presses, a little bit more preparation as well. But also another thing that you can do with Seraphin, obviously you can combine with Crusader as well, is actually go with Inquisition. Now, this will be a very high setup, a very high GCD heavy setup and sort of playstyle where you're essentially keeping up 2 buffs. So it kind of feels like a classic Retribution Paladin where you're just keeping up buffs, which is kind of cool. So you're just keeping Inquisition up, and then you press Seraphin. So you're kind of just keeping these buffs up, Seraphin every 45 seconds, and Inquisition just keeping it up all the time, right? So you get this really cool visual effect on your character where, your hands are glowing, you get the Paladin Hammer, and then you can go into Avenging Wrath and even look even more awesome, right? So I do like the aesthetic look with Seraphin and Inquisition, and gameplay wise I do like the idea of just kind of keeping up buffs and stuff like that. But what I was saying is I do like this sort of build setup that you can go for where you kind of just focusing on buffs and keeping that up, and where your damage is not just centered around your cooldown windows, but you have more sustained damage. I think that's the best way to put it. Now, what one will be best? Again, we'll figure that out during beta and stuff like that. Numbers isn't something I'm really gonna discuss here. I'm just talking about how it feels, where the spec is going and stuff like that. But in general, I do like the sort of choices that we have here. They all feel pretty distinct, right? They all feel like completely different playstyles, and I do enjoy that. I like the idea of that. So that pretty much covers our talents and our baseline paladin. So let's talk about the last thing, which is Covenant abilities. Now, the Paladin, specifically Retribution Covenant abilities, are a bit of a hit and miss. There's some pretty cool ones, granted. So we have Divine Toll, which is the Kyrian Covenant ability, and it's essentially providing you AoE judgment. Now, what this will pretty much allow is, say, go for a bigger Divine Storm. So this is applying judgment on 5 targets, so the debuff. So it's allowing you to go for a Divine Storm that will deal 25% more extra damage, right? So there's a cool synergy there. The only thing is the effect of the ability feels a little bit too underwhelming, right? Because in protection you have this on Avenger's shield, so it looks fantastic, awesome. But on judgments, it's a little bit more tamed, right? It doesn't really have the spectacle but it's still pretty good. The only issue as well is that this ability is essentially completely worthless in single target fights, so for raids and stuff like that, completely worthless. Now, it's not completely worthless because it was essentially getting to judgment to use, but for the most part, yeah, it's completely worthless. It's almost a dead button. Essentially, you're gonna be able to do a 25, stronger Templar's Verdict every 1 minute or so, and that's kind of it. It really sucks for single target. Then we have Vanquisher's Hammer. This is the Necrolord's Covenant ability. Now, this is kind of similar to Divine Toll. You are also throwing a hammer, so it's a pretty similar ability to Judgment, but it's empowering your next Templar's Verdict to also and automatically trigger Divine Storm. So it's essentially giving you 2 spenders in 1 GCD. Now, visually, this is fantastic. It feels really cool to use because you just go for a Templar's Verdict and then you get the Divine Storm effect, which is cool. Gameplay, it does change your thinking a little bit. So when you use this ability, your next spender to use, even in cleave situations, even in AoE situations, it's going to be Templar's Verdict because you're going to get the Divine Storm going. That Divine Storm is also going to be buffed by if you're using Righteous Verdict, right? So it's going to get some extra damage out as well. But in general, this feels more of a single target ability, right? It's just a flat damage increase to your single target damage every, whatever the cooldown is. I cannot quite recall. It's on the screen, right? So it feels more single target focused, but also feels, it functions pretty well for, cleave, AoE, stuff like that, due to the nature of Divine Storm. Then we have Ashen Hollow, which is the Venthyr Covenant ability. This is pretty much a weird ability. Why? Because it's dealing shadow damage, right? Basically creating this really huge concentration area, but it's red, shadow, and it's going to be dealing damage to anyone inside of it. It's also going to be healing your allies, and any target that remains inside of that area is going to allow you to use your Hammer of Wrath. So essentially you're going to become a Hammer of Wrath machine. The only issue I have with this is, one, it has a really huge cast time, which feels really clunky for Retribution. It feels very off, on top of it being shadow damage. And then it's also on a really big cooldown, so I'm not entirely sure where this could be used effectively. I mean, it's a very cool ability, don't get me wrong, but in real scenarios, I mean, maybe I'm seeing it wrong, but in real scenarios, I'm not seeing a huge use for this, outside of it just being pretty cool, right? Then we have the last Covenant ability, which is the Nightfade Covenant ability, which is the Blessing of the Seasons. Now, this one is going to be iterated upon, so take it with a grain of salt, because right now it's a little bit broken. So it's essentially giving you new auras. It's giving you 4 auras: Summer, Autumn, Winter, and Spring, and each one of them are going to be on a 15-second cooldown, and as you use them, they're going to be switched by another aura. So essentially, it's a very support-based Covenant ability. It's not like you're getting this pretty cool damaging ability or anything like that. It feels a little bit more like a holy thing. So essentially, the Summer aura is causing your attacks to have a chance to deal holy damage, and everyone in your raid. So there's that, hence the support feel from this ability. You get Autumn, which is making your cooldowns recover 10% faster, and again, everyone in the raid as well, which is insane. You get Winter, which is reducing the movement speed of enemies within 40 yards by 20%, and their attack speed by 10%. Once again, can have its some nice uses. And Spring, which is increasing your healing done and healing received by 10%, once again to everyone in the raid. So once again, just like the Autumn one, pretty freaking insane. So at this point, the way the ability is now, you kind of just want to have a shitload of Paladins just to stack those abilities up and just get these crazy benefits. Now again, like I said, this is going to be iterated upon, so take it with a grain of salt. So yeah, that pretty much covers the Retribution Paladin. Again, Retribution Paladin just feels more feature complete at this point, which it's good that we now feel like a complete class. I don't know if that's saying much or not saying enough. I mean, it's kind of to be expected that our class feels complete, because in BFA it didn't at all. So it's nice that it finally feels complete in Shadowlands. Our talents are pretty good in my opinion. We have some pretty cool options, some pretty cool playstyles that we can go for depending on our choices, though, numbers will kind of decide on that in the end. There's some worries, of course, on Retribution Paladin, primarily on numbers right now. They're a bit low on some abilities, but hopefully that gets tuned out by beta, right? But in general, I had a really nice time with Retribution Paladin that I wasn't expecting at all. And I think, again, the biggest reason of that is the fact that we now have a feature-complete Retribution Paladin with Wake of Ashes, with Hammer of Wrath, on top of our, classic playstyle of building and spending holy power. So I think that's pretty good. Alright guys, so do let me know what you think down below on Retribution Paladin, and thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.